Welcome back to my Twisted Metal retrospective. Following the release of the first two Twisted Metal games on the original PlayStation, developer SingleTrac was bought out by publisher GT Interactive. Now, due to contractual obligations, SingleTrac were unable to continue working on their beloved Car Combat series, which was owned by Sony Computer Entertainment. I think allowing themselves to be bought out by GT Interactive, as lucrative as the deal may have seemed at the time, was a bad move, seeing as several projects planned for SingleTrac on the PC and the N64 never materialized, and they would be stuck treading water, making a few racing games and Twisted Metal knockoffs like Critical Depth and Rogue Trip before their untimely closure in 2000. Development on a third Twisted Metal title began immediately after the release of Twisted Metal 2, and the game would hit store shelves in November of 1998, with Twisted Metal 4 coming a year after that, in '99. One of the issues Twisted Metal had that I think was a contributing factor to its shortened longevity and overall appeal was the fact that the games were coming out far too quickly in those early years. It had become a cheap cash cow. I mean, on the PS1 alone, there were 5 Twisted Metal games in total, between 1995 and 2001. That's insane, given how simple the concept behind them was. That's why, by the time the PlayStation 2 rolled around with Twisted Metal Black, I believe this franchise was having to pick up the pieces a little bit and try to repair the hole it sort of burned into itself and the entire car combat genre. Keep in mind, there were other vehicular combat games being released alongside Twisted Metal during those formidable years, some of which developed by SingleTrac themselves. The car combat genre had simply become too oversaturated in a very short period of time. The entire gaming industry was changing as well, and as the hardware of these newer 3D consoles were becoming more and more powerful, those buying them began looking for more layered mechanics and single-player stories within their video games. Basic ones like Twisted Metal slowly fell out of favor with the masses. I think the franchise could have benefited greatly by having a few more years in between releases, even if multiple developers had been behind the wheel of them. Having Twisted Metal games spanning several consoles and gaming generations would have done wonders for the series, and allowed it to find its voice and a lot more fans much easier. I'm still happy with the games we do have, but I always find myself asking what it could have been like if we had multiple Twisted Metal titles on each of the PlayStation consoles, what those kinds of games could have achieved, how they could have evolved naturally over time. Anywho, I'm getting sidetracked. I'll talk more about this stuff in my review of Twisted Metal 2012. Let's get back to Twisted Metal 3. Development duties for the game would be handed over to an internal team at Sony, the California-based 989 Studios. The development window for it was very small, under 1 year, and adding to the difficulty was the fact that, while they didn't own the Twisted Metal IP, SingleTrac did own the engine the previous 2 Twisted Metal games had run on. Sony and 989 Studios could not legally use it, and an entirely new engine had to be created from scratch for the greenlit third installment. More accurately, the developers were having to transform the source code of a previous game they worked on, a Formula 1 racer called Kart World Series, into a car combat one. Given the strict deadline they had, the resources available to them, it's impressive what 989 Studios were able to achieve with the third and fourth Twisted Metal games. From a structural standpoint, they were as good as they were gonna get gameplay-wise given the circumstances. That said, I'm not completely defending these games. I think the whole approach 989 Studios took to Twisted Metal was misguided from the start. I mentioned in my first part of my retrospective that the vehicles in Twisted Metal should not, nor should they ever be, viewed as simply cars with weapons. They don't function like that. They are turrets, first and foremost, ones that should be able to swivel when stationary. Twisted Metal is not a series of driving games, not a series of racing games. They are a form of combat games, shooting games, and if their gameplay leans more into driving or racing genres, then everything in them begins to fall apart. Case in point, Twisted Metals 3 and 4. 989 Studios decided to add in a physics system, making the vehicles move and react like real ones do. If you want to turn yourself around, you need to build up enough speed first, and then use the handbrake. Instead of your vehicle flipping through the air and automatically righting itself like in past games, now you get to lie on your back and take it up the ass for a couple seconds at a time. The lighter vehicles are like turtles for the most part in Twisted Metal 3. It's so much fun not being able to move until the game decides when it's ready. The physics in these games, especially Twisted Metal 3, slow the action down to a crawl compared to previous Twisted Metals. Now, in all honesty, as much as Twisted Metal 3 gets wrong, I do have a soft spot for it, because it was the first Twisted Metal game I ever played as a kid. Both the 989 Studios games were. Twisted Metal 3 polarizes fans of the franchise, for reasons I will be getting into, don't you worry, but you must realize it is the highest selling entry in the Twisted Metal series. Therefore, it's the one most people have played and are familiar with. It was released at the absolute height of Twisted Metal's mainstream popularity, which quite frankly was never really that mainstream to begin with, at least not outside North America. I grew up in Canada, and I even had friends who had never played or heard of Twisted Metal before. The series was always niche compared to many other gaming franchises we'd talk about on the playground. So yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with Twisted Metal 3. As frustrating as it can be sometimes, it does still find ways to make me smile and think back to the days of old, playing this game with my twin brother in our youth. I know Twisted Metal 3 and 4 have a lot of continuity errors in them. They make a lot of peculiar, creative choices, we'll say, in regards to the mythology, so much so that fans widely accept them as taking place in an alternate timeline. That's the only way a lot of what happens in them makes any sort of sense. And I know that Twisted Metal 4 improves on some of the rougher gameplay elements found in its predecessor. It is more tolerable to play, and technically speaking, it also scored better too from gaming journalists, but I've always considered Twisted Metal 3 to be the superior game overall, because its aesthetic at least tries to resemble what the first two games were going for. Design-wise, it still grounds itself in ways. Twisted Metal 4 got way too bizarre and gimmicky for me. It's like it took place on another planet entirely, in some alternate dimension. I feel an even greater disconnect with it, especially now, having played all of the other games in this series, but I'll get into all that a little later in this video. Twisted Metal 3 and 4 not only implemented new physics for the vehicles, but also made improvements to the AI system at play, which honestly is one of their high points, making them two of the best in the series in this regard. Enemies don't just attack you, spamming freeze missiles and specials like those are the only two weapons in their inventory, but now will also clearly attack each other. You will drive around and find enemies with less health than they had before, hear your opponent's weapons being fired from afar. Some fans hate this kind of AI in Twisted Metal because they say it makes the games too easy, but I disagree. We've seen the other kind of AI in the other games work to both the benefit and detriment of their gameplay as well. Twisted Metal 2 was too difficult, and Twisted Metal Head-On, even on the hardest difficulty, was a cakewalk. Both games use the same form of AI, and both are on opposite sides of the spectrum in terms of their challenge levels. I don't think who the AI targets is the root of these issues present in these games. It's a combination of factors: the damage amounts assigned to the weapons, the game's controls, and how each of the vehicles handle, their health and special weapon stats. It's not fair to just blame the AI and the AI alone. Personally, I like the AI in Twisted Metal 3 and 4. I think it's effective. The Twisted Metal competition is supposed to be every man for themselves, but it doesn't always feel that way at times in a lot of these games. Having everyone gun each other down instead of ganging up on one person makes everything feel a lot more realistic and believable. As much as I enjoy the improved AI in combat in these 989 Studios games, there is a downside to it. Enemies and even bosses will always go for health now, whenever they can, speeding to it with their turbo if necessary. The AI is almost too smart, like you're playing with an actual human being. Not only is the computer constantly taking precious health pickups away from you as the player, but if you're out of ammo in your inventory, and the character you're playing as doesn't have the best special weapon, you can find yourself in this endless gameplay loop with your opponents, even bosses, that run away from you like little bitches just when things start getting interesting. There is a cheat that has the AI ignore health pickups if that better suits your playthrough. I always play with the AI as it was intended, but sometimes the battles last longer than they need to, and become a bit stale when your enemies constantly go for health. The physics knocking you around don't help matters. Neither does the stupid regeneration gimmick in many of the stages. Once you've beaten all your opponents, a few of them will respawn as an added hurdle before you can progress to the next stage. It's just a lazy way for the game to pad out its length. Twisted Metal 3 isn't the longest game in the series, but it can still feel like a real chore to sit through, a pain in the ass to beat. Thankfully, this is the only Twisted Metal game that uses the regeneration mechanic. The character roster in Twisted Metal 3 honestly isn't that bad. I've never had much of a problem with it. Their motivations and endings are an entirely different story, but the roster itself on the surface is fine. Some of the redesigns for the returning drivers and their replacements in some instances leave a lot to be desired, and in the case of Sweet Tooth are downright insulting, but you've got a lot of familiar vehicles making a comeback here, like Axel, Mr. Grimm, Hammerhead, Roadkill, Warthog, Thumper, Spectre, and Outlaw. Sweet Tooth and Minion are both unlockable and can only be accessed using cheat codes, but they're easy to remember. Sweet Tooth's is left, 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 right, right, and Minion's is right, 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 left, left. I'll probably remember these until the day I die. The look and overall shape of Sweet Tooth's ice cream truck in this game is great, but the revolving clown head on its roof is the ugliest it's ever been in the series by far. I don't know who thought that face looked good, but it doesn't at all. Even the fire hair is shit. I preferred the static image used in Twisted Metal 1 and 2. It was primitive, sure, but far less distracting during gameplay. One thing I will make perfectly clear, though, is that Twisted Metal 3 has my favorite design for the Minion tank, trading the black and darker blue coloring from past games for green. Whenever I think of Minion, this is the version of the vehicle that pops into my mind. All of the returning vehicles have similar special weapons to what they had in Twisted Metal 1 and 2. Notable differences are found in a couple, though. Roadkill's boomerang from Twisted Metal 2 has now become a spiked lobbed bomb. Thumper's iconic flamethrower has also been replaced with powerful sound waves now, which I honestly don't mind. A lot of vehicles in Twisted Metal have had flamethrowers or flamethrower variations as special weapons over the years. It felt like a lazy placeholder attack at times. I prefer when all of the vehicles have special weapons completely unique to them in each game, but I get that there's only so much you can do with machine guns, missiles, and energy strapped to or coming out of a car. Most of the new contestants in this game have only appeared in Twisted Metal 3, the only exception being the Mr. Slam wannabe Augur, who reappeared in TM4. It's described as a construction vehicle, but I don't think this thing exists in the real world. The closest vehicle like it, I believe, would be the Trencher, with the saw blade thing. I think 989 Studios just needed an excuse to stick a massive drill to the front of something that could spin and throw opposing vehicles around. Whether the vehicle Augur exists or not in the real world, I don't know construction tech. It's still a cool concept, despite the character being just a watered-down rehash of Mr. Slam at the end of the day. Firestarter is a tricked-out hot rod with flame decals. Its special weapon is, as you could probably guess, a flamethrower, all the more reason to change Thumper's special to something else in this game. The eco-friendly punch buggy Flower Power is driven by an environmentalist and fires a flower-shaped projectile at its opponents. And finally, the last new contestant in Twisted Metal 3 is Club Kid, a mini with yellow stripes and smiley faces on it. While it doesn't have the strongest special weapon to ever appear in a Twisted Metal game, it definitely has one of the most annoying. It shoots out this vortex onto the ground that pulls in every vehicle in its vicinity, and when it reaches terminal velocity, it explodes. When playing against a CPU Club Kid, you might get one or two placed down at a time, and can escape their grasp with enough turbo, but I remember my brother and I banking specials and placing like 5 down at once to ensure the other player was trapped in a sea of vortexes. It was like taking away someone's controller for 30 seconds at a time. When one vortex exploded, another one would pull you towards it. You were guaranteed to run out of turbo trying to get out of them. It was an endless nightmare, and would even slow the game's frame rate down, but we didn't care. Twisted Metal 3 is set in the then-future year of 2008, 2 years after the events of Twisted Metal 2. The game isn't considered canon by the Twisted Metal fanbase due to its numerous and glaring continuity errors, most of which I will bring up when I go into the character endings. We see that Calypso still rides around in his blimp, which is being bombarded by an ominous lightning storm. Rather than use a series of drawings, Twisted Metal 3 implemented 3D cinematics, a first for the series. Calypso looks the exact same as before, and is voiced once again by Mel McMurrin, but for whatever reason, his face is no longer disfigured. I guess that car accident that killed his family never happened.
I am Calypso. Each year I gather the 12 worthiest drivers to face off in the Twisted Metal competition. They must face each other and some of my friends to claim the ultimate prize. I grant a single wish, whatever the winner asks for. To the losers, death. Welcome to Twisted Metal.
The level design in Twisted Metal 3 has been heavily criticized by fans and critics alike, and yeah, the arenas are pretty shitty in this game. I like the concepts behind them and locations by themselves, but their layouts are extremely flat and uninspired, though apparently this was out of necessity to make the AI work. Level 1 is Hollywood. The City of Angels had been destroyed by a great earthquake in 2007. There's a partial highway with ramps you can jump off, but you're really just driving around a bunch of rubble. Honestly, even if there hadn't been an earthquake, I feel like Los Angeles would have still been devastated following the multiple Twisted Metal tournaments that have torn through it over the years. Level 2 is Washington, D.C., right in front of the United States Capitol building. This is, without a doubt, one of the worst stages in Twisted Metal history. Probably the worst of them all, really. It's just a simple square with the Capitol and the steps leading up to it on one side, and then some roads, grass, and a couple statues that can be destroyed making up the rest of it. The black semi-truck, Darkseid, is the boss you face at the end of the stage. This is the first and only appearance Darkseid has made as a boss in the series. It's also really odd that Mr. Ash is taking orders from Calypso here. The two clearly didn't get along before. Calypso had stolen the Demon Black from him, and Mr. Ash forcefully took him back during his ending in Twisted Metal 1. Being that this game is set in the future, there are large stone walls surrounding the Capitol. You kinda wish they had those in 2021, am I right? Who knew the insanity and violence of Twisted Metal would be tame compared to what we'd see there in real life? The third arena you fight in is Hangar 18, part of the experimental Air Force base and training facility known as Area 51 in Nevada. We go from fighting in a square to a circle. This one at least has more verticality than the Washington level. If you destroy all of the control panels, you can disarm the defenses of the UFO in the center and take a portal up to the top of it. There, behind the protective dome of its cockpit, you can find the spaceship pickup that electrifies all of the vehicles on the lower level for massive damage. The fourth stage, the North Pole, is a bit ridiculous even for Twisted Metal standards, but it is one of the more memorable and humorous stages in the game, so I can't complain. You can drive through igloos, snowmen, there are some ice patches scattered about, and of course, you can destroy Santa's workshop and all of the precious toys his elves had made for the children. Anyone else smell burning gingerbread? The worst aspect of this level is the snow pit surrounding Santa's fortress that acts as a moat. You'll spend the vast majority of your time down there, falling into it on your back due to the game's physics. Getting out of it is also a pain because there is only one ramp leading to the surface. The regeneration mechanic first rears its ugly head in the North Pole level, but by the following one, London, you're already sick of it. In London, you have to take out 5 opponents, plus some that come back with regeneration, and then end it all off with a boss battle against Minion. It's grueling, and not in the fun, challenging kind of way. Minion is a bit of a pushover as well, nowhere near as difficult as he was in Twisted Metal 1 and 2. The London stage is deceiving. It gives the illusion that it's this large and layered environment, but it's just a flat rectangle with boxed buildings placed everywhere. It's another one of the weaker arenas in Twisted Metal 3, despite its size. Sure, it's got the Big Ben clock tower visible in the background, but that has nothing on Paris and its destructible Eiffel Tower, opening up an entirely new level on the city's rooftops in Twisted Metal 2. Twisted Metal 3's essential rooftop level is Tokyo. You can't die from falling off the buildings like in many other rooftop stages in the series, apart from one area of it that has a deadly spinning fan below it, but there is fresh lava on the ground following the eruption of a nearby volcano, presumably Mount Fuji. The longer you drive on it, the more damage your vehicle sustains. Its function is the exact same as the molten lava from the Amazonia level in Twisted Metal 2, a form of risk and reward, gathering additional weapons and fighting any opponents down there. Tokyo isn't the best rooftop level in the franchise, but it's still halfway decent. I give it a pass. Egypt is a pretty bland level. I love ancient mythology, and driving around an ancient Egyptian sphinx, pyramid, and within underground tombs is neat. You can get the eye of the pyramid on one end of the map to shoot a powerful laser at your enemies if you time it right. This is another level that feels too simple though. Set pieces and lumpy terrain aren't enough to mask its flat emptiness. The Egypt level in Head On is so much better. And last but not least, we have Calypso's Blimp, the 8th and final level to close off this installment of the Twisted Metal tournament. It's cool that the blimp seen hovering over Los Angeles in the last game has now become its own battleground in Twisted Metal 3, the last obstacle standing in the way of you and your wish. Twisted Metal 3 has some of the worst levels in the series as a whole, but I'd have to say the best of the bunch is Calypso's Blimp. Well, more of a Zeppelin really. It has the most significance narratively. It has multiple floors to it, more verticality than most of the other levels combined. There's a falling hazard in one part, and to win, the game has you explore every corner of it to find 4 switches to turn off lasers on the top floor so you can destroy a final switch and, at long last, deactivate Calypso's irritating regeneration machine. You have to do this before driving headlong into battle because your enemies will infinitely respawn in this level, unlike the rest. I should mention one of the stronger aspects of these 989 Studios games. They have some of the best soundtracks in the entire Twisted Metal series. Most levels in TM3 feature licensed music from Pitch Shifter, 1 Minute Silence, Ghoul Spoon, Scold, Cypress Hill, and most predominantly Rob Zombie at the peak of his mainstream success. These rock and heavy metal tracks match the hard-hitting and explosive action of Twisted Metal to a T. Rob Zombie's Meet the Creeper was the main theme for the game, and it plays during the finale on Calypso's Blimp. Even though the gameplay in Twisted Metal 3 and 4 is subpar, their soundtracks help elevate the action in them in a big way. The final boss of Twisted Metal 3 is Primeval. I think he's mid-tier when it comes to final bosses in the series. On one hand, the gameplay side of it, he can be rather challenging, firing a special weapon that looks to be a combination of the ones used by Mr. Grimm and Roadkill. He does a lot of damage, and the size of his vehicle is definitely imposing. The game's manual didn't show his picture, which also added a bit of intrigue. You had to make it that far in the game to see what he and his vehicle looked like, and when I first saw him as a kid, I was deeply unsettled by it. That said, Primeval has absolutely no backstory apart from working for Calypso and being the guardian of his blimp. We can assume he is some type of demon though. The model of the driver has red eyes and possibly even a horn coming out of his head. Primeval is a relatively interesting character on paper, a minion 2.0, but since he's not given any real backstory or reason for being there, he also comes off as a forgettable and non-existent one as well. Alright, I have not been looking forward to the next section of this review, when I go into each of the character endings and rank them from worst to best. Twisted Metal 3 has what are widely regarded to be the worst endings in the entire franchise, and it's not hard to see why. The execution of them is horrendous. They are all presented in the exact same way. The vehicles drive into Calypso's lair. He makes their wishes for them because none of the drivers get to speak, and he then proceeds to fuck every single one of them over, stripping Calypso of any sort of complexity you could give him as a character. There are continuity errors in the ones involving returning characters. They rely solely on cheap shock value, and all are extremely short, lasting about 30 seconds on average. The weak writing and poor execution of these endings is maddening in and of itself, but what I find more irksome is that they are all structurally dead on arrival, because the wishes described in the driver's bio pages are deceiving, and don't match up with the wishes they receive. What these characters say make absolutely no sense, state the obvious, or are completely irrelevant. You have no idea what a lot of these drivers want and why they are competing in Twisted Metal in the first place. Without any clear motivation going in, there's really nothing to look forward to or expect from a lot of these endings. They don't matter. I do want to throw it out there that these ending cinematics were outsourced to a different company than 989 Studios, Visionscape Imaging, so it's not fair to blame 989 for their quality, at least not entirely. The videos were completed before some of the character designs had been locked down, which is why some of the driver appearances in these cutscenes don't match what's shown on their menu screens. That might explain the written elements not lining up with many of them either. Again, Twisted Metal 3 had a very short development window. A lot of work was being done on it simultaneously by different teams, and then everything was hastily put together. The car combat genre was booming in the late 90s. A lot of copycat franchises were on the rise, and Sony wanted to make sure Twisted Metal stayed on top. But to do so meant that the development of Twisted Metal 3 and 4 had to be rushed. That's business for you. Anyways, the worst ending in Twisted Metal 3, which I guess makes it the worst ending in the Twisted Metal series, would have to be Outlaw's. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Outlaw had my favorite ending in the original Twisted Metal, and one of my favorite endings in Twisted Metal 2, but here it's utter garbage. In Twisted Metal 3, Outlaw is driven by Jamie and Carol Roberts, though for some unknown reason his name is now Buzz. Maybe it's just a nickname, or maybe 989 Studios intended it to be an entirely different character altogether. Who knows? Looking at the bio screen for the Roberts siblings, it's safe to assume they just want revenge against Calypso for what happened to them in previous tournaments. When they win the contest, though, Calypso says they wish for everyone to live in a clean and safe world, which throws the direct conflict between these characters right out the window. The game then frames the twist that happens as this horrifying outcome, the cops being out of work because the world is so peaceful. But it's not a horrible outcome. They can just find other jobs. The thought of them being powerless in this situation is just stupid. Furthermore, Calypso comes off like a complete moron here. He willingly puts an end to his baby, Twisted Metal, with a smile on his face. He's oblivious to the fact that he lost, not them. What a dumbass. Axel's ending is a mess. Just read his motivation here. Remember that he tore both his arms out of his machine at the end of Twisted Metal 2, becoming a free man, and escaping the control of his abusive father. Now, it says he's climbed back into it so he can finally be free. An oxymoron. In his ending, Calypso says Axel's wish is to become one complete machine. How that achieves freedom is beyond anyone's guess. And why the fuck would Axel want any of this? It goes against everything this character represented before. Whatever. He gets turned into an alarm clock. A fucking alarm clock. Do I even have to make fun of this shit? A lot of people have shit on Sweet Tooth's ending over the years, and yeah, it's really bad. But the biggest issue I have with it starts with his bio page. It doesn't appear that Needles Kane is a serial killer anymore, just a deranged ice cream truck driver who is obsessed with ice cream and candy. His bio page tells us nothing. He has a lot of sweets and explosive treats. Cool. What do you want as a character? What is it you are fighting for? In the end, his wish is to eat all the ice cream and candy he wants like he's 6. And because he didn't brush between snacks, he finds himself in a long and painful dental procedure. 989 Studios thought Sweet Tooth and his wish needed to be crazy. That's all there is to this character apparently. How misconceived. Augur's ending is just awful, awful. Buster Cobb is an angry construction worker, upset that all of his projects have been destroyed as a result of the tournament. He says he's entering Twisted Metal to, get this, eliminate his opponents. Yeah, I would assume so. That's how this shit works, genius. When you reach his ending, Calypso says Augur wishes to see his inner child, which I'd say is way the fuck off the mark, but then again, much like Sweet Tooth, we don't even know what the man's wish really was to begin with. At least the twist is funnier than Sweet Tooth's, I guess. Cobb gets turned into a baby in a crib. The driver of Hammerhead in Twisted Metal 3 isn't a pair of teenagers this time around. No, 989 Studios cranked that age dial way up. Granny Dread is one of the more ridiculous drivers in this franchise, in my opinion, and that's saying a lot. Something about her is just too goofy to get behind. All this violence wouldn't be good for her blood pressure or brittle bones. Is she even fit to drive at that age? The old granny is upset that her peaceful neighborhood has been destroyed by Twisted Metal. She wants to run it and its creator out of town for good. A noble goal, but her wish is ultimately revealed to be her wanting to just sit at home and watch TV. This is a nothing wish, something she could easily achieve by herself without Calypso's powers and without risking her life in the Twisted Metal competition. Even if she doesn't have a home to go back to, I'm sure she could find another. Worst case scenario, go live in a retirement home. Problem solved. Just like Hammerhead, Bruce Cochran, the driver of Thumper, has a pointless wish as well. After fighting for 10 years all over the world, he wants to just relax and hang with his homies, something you could do yourself at any time. The twist is pretty bland and insensitive. Small heads of Cochran, Cobb, and Kane are hanging from a rearview mirror. It's weird that Thumper's friends are his Twisted Metal enemies he's tried to kill numerous times. Club Kid's wish is very simple. He wants to party all night long. But like the last two I've brought up, this is something that doesn't require Calypso's powers or competing in the Twisted Metal tournament to attain, making it irrelevant. Regardless, Calypso grants Club Kid's wish, but sends him to Alaska where he freezes to death, because the nights are several months long. The twist here is fine, but like the next few endings I will be looking at, its execution is very piss poor. The driver of Spectre is Lance Wilder. He's clearly a womanizer based off his bio page. The manual implies he's an aspiring actor looking to become famous, just like the driver of Spectre in Twisted Metal 2. Unlike the character's ending in Twisted Metal 2, however, one of the more offbeat and memorable in the franchise, this one is very vanilla. Wilder gets trapped in a television set. It's a decent idea in theory, but how it's been realized is what kills it. I also hate that Wilder is a lazy rehash of Ken Masters. These characters are identical. What's the point of giving them separate names? Mr. Grimm's twist is slightly better, but I find it pitiful for the sheer disrespect it shows this iconic, fan-favorite character. Also, how rushed the whole thing comes off. Twisted Metal 3 sorta combines his goals from the previous two games. Grimm's hunger for souls is never satiated. He wishes to feed on the darkest and most powerful soul of them all, Calypso's. His ending has Calypso state this, and then immediately overpower Grimm and curb stomp him. The joke is that instead of getting Calypso's immortal soul, he only gets the soul of his shoe, but that punchline is desperate and has been delivered in the quickest and laziest way imaginable. Grimm doesn't even put up a fight either. The Grim fucking Reaper. Roadkill's ending feels complete and fully realized, unlike the last several, but is just unsurprising and uneventful, which is why it sucks all the same. The driver's name is Marcus Kane in Twisted Metal 3, but his connection with Needles is non-existent. It makes me wonder if the added Kane surname was a goof, or an idea 989 Studios had come up with themselves, or taken from the original Twisted Metal developers, and were going to follow up on in Twisted Metal 4, which of course they never did. When I was a kid, I assumed Marcus and Needles were possibly estranged brothers. I would never have guessed they were the same person, something revealed years later in Twisted Metal Head On. In Twisted Metal 3, Marcus had received a transmission from Area 51 from a group of aliens. They told him he is destined to win the Twisted Metal tournament. Calypso says his wish is for solitude among the pines. Marcus is transported to a padded room inside of an insane asylum called Whispering Pines. So, a psychologically disturbed man gets put in a psychiatric hospital. Sounds about right. There's nothing interesting or surprising about this ending at all. Flower Power's driver is an environmentalist named Amber Rose, who looks like she could be a Bond girl. Her goal is to save the planet from all the violence and destruction plaguing it. The manual says she doesn't mind causing any collateral damage competing in the Twisted Metal tournament if it means she can undo everything later, but she still comes off as a huge hypocrite. Who's to say she'll even win the contest and get what she wants? If she dies during it, it will be as a sinner and not a saint. Her involvement in Twisted Metal is just odd. I don't know why she's there. Anywho, her ending has Calypso say her wish is to have the world covered in flowers, which I mean is true, but a gross simplification. She gets eaten by a couple large Venus flytraps. The irony here is adequately entertaining. I'm pulling at straws at this point, but you have to with Twisted Metal 3's endings. Firestarter's ending is another relatively fun and ironic one. Damian Coles is a loon, a pyromaniac. The game manual says he torched his family home as a child. His bio page indicates that his plan is to send Calypso's blimp burning to the ground like a 4th of July firecracker. His ending doesn't match up with this assumed wish, however, as Calypso grants him a barbecue with all of his friends. We see Coles spinning rotisserie style over a fire. He's the one on the menu, implying that some cannibalism is about to go on. Yikes. This ending is passable. It's kinda satisfying seeing a person like this get their comeuppance for all the pain they've caused over the years. That's about it though. The aging war veteran Captain Rogers has returned in Twisted Metal 3, behind the wheel of Warthog. His bio page doesn't really say a whole lot of anything. He's an undying warrior, 107 years old and still fighting. His ending in Twisted Metal 2 had him ask for the body of a 20-year-old, which he got, but now he wants the head to match. I like how this ending makes reference to what had happened in the previous game. That's a plus. I also like the twist, Calypso giving him the head of the 20-year-old Rogers got his body from in a glass jar filled with fluid. It's another FU to Rogers. I just think it could have been executed much, much better. Now I want to reiterate that none of the endings in Twisted Metal 3 are good. To be honest, I don't even know how accurate my rankings of them are because so many bleed together into a cesspool of shit. I'm just doing this as a matter of principle. I set out to do this with every Twisted Metal game I'm covering, and I'm going to see it through, but I do know for a fact that my favorite ending in Twisted Metal 3 has always been Minions. His biopic is fucking badass. Not only is the design of his tank in this game my favorite in the franchise, but the design for Minion himself is the best the series has ever had as well, and I will happily die on that hill. Minion's stat page has him threatening the player and explaining that if you can beat him, he will help you hunt down Calypso. Basically, he wants Calypso dead, whether that's because Calypso had previously stolen his powers or enslaved him like the game's manual would suggest. His ending, much like so many in this game, introduces an undisclosed wish that he wants to spend the rest of eternity in Hell, his home. Instead, Calypso sends him to the snowy Hell, Michigan. I like this twist. It's pretty funny, effective, and the one I remember the most fondly from Twisted Metal 3. Again, it's not great. None of the endings in this game are, but it's the least painful to watch in my opinion. Acceptable. Though it does beg the question, why Minion couldn't just open up a portal to Hell himself? He's done so in the past. Maybe he still doesn't have his full powers back after being enslaved by Calypso. I don't know, nor do I really care. On we go now to Twisted Metal 4, released in late 1999. Because most of the work had been done on Twisted Metal 3 just to get it out the door, 989 Studios had a bit more leeway to fine-tune some of the gameplay in its sequel. They eased up on the physics, and now your car would automatically right itself when it flipped over, a godsend. Additional weapons that were only featured in Twisted Metal 3 and 4 included the Mortar, a launched homing explosive, the Rain Missile, which showered fireballs down on your opponent, and the addictive Speed Missiles that have low damage but can be spammed by holding the fire button down. Twisted Metal 4 had 4 more weapons not in the last game that have never returned since. These include the Rain 2 Missile, Remote Freeze Bomb, and the Auto-Lobs and Merv missiles that bombard enemies with several warheads at once. The visuals in Twisted Metal 4 were enhanced. Backgrounds, weapon effects, and the cars themselves all look better, the vehicles having this sheen to them now. The level design in the game was given far more praise than in Twisted Metal 3. Many of them are much larger, have a lot more verticality to them, and more hidden areas and gimmicks to find and take advantage of. I do think many of them have become too big, though, that it can take a while to find enemies, slowing the action of the game down dramatically. You'll find yourself driving aimlessly, waiting to attack a lot of times. I also find myself getting stuck on surface edges a lot more in Twisted Metal 4, and because accelerating and reversing is done using the face buttons instead of the D-pad now, I activate turbo when I quickly change directions, frequently double tapping triangle or X by mistake, which is annoying. Twisted Metal 4 made a lot of solid improvements in terms of graphics and gameplay. It even had stronger character endings than in Twisted Metal 3, which I will be getting into, but I've never been a fan of this one personally. It's my least favorite Twisted Metal game in the franchise. I can tolerate it, I played a lot of it when I was younger, but it's the one I rarely, if ever, revisit nowadays. I just don't like the art style of it, the flamboyant and deranged techno-circus vibe it has. It's a bit much, too needless, excessive, and distracting, and it makes the game stick out like a sore thumb from all the other entries in the series, even its wacky predecessor. Its futuristic visuals that a lot of media was adopting at the turn of the new millennium has become rather unappealing today. I don't think it's aged very well. Aesthetically, I find Twisted Metal 4 to be kinda ugly, the ugly duckling of the Twisted Metal series. A major problem I'm faced with each and every time I pop this game into my console is choosing who the fuck to play as. From the 13 playable characters at the start, only 2 of them are returning contestants. The rest are completely original and only appeared in Twisted Metal 4, never to be seen or heard from again, and for good reason. A few of them are recycled vehicles and drivers from past games with a shittier coat of paint, making me wonder why more of the previous vehicles couldn't have been implemented as regular contestants. The vast majority of the characters in Twisted Metal 4 are some of the most stereotypical, gimmicky, and shallow-as-hell cartoons I've ever seen. I'll talk more about them in detail when I go over each character, their wish, and their ending, but Jesus Christ, this is the weakest roster to ever appear in a Twisted Metal game. It's so bad. Now I know some of you out there are yelling at your screens, but NerdGasm, there are 22 characters in total, the most in any Twisted Metal game, if you include the 9 unlockable boss vehicles, 5 of which are souped-up versions of past competitors. How could you not be on board for all that? How could you still think this is the weakest selection? Well, what makes up a character in Twisted Metal to me is a car and a driver, and all the souped-up versions of these iconic ones, like Thumper, Axel, and Mr. Slam, are just fancy-looking shells in Twisted Metal 4, and nothing more. Their drivers are non-existent. We don't even know if they're the same characters as they were in past games. The story reasoning for them being there is also very insubstantial. I'll get to that in a sec. The one thing Twisted Metal 4 has that no other game in the series has offered players since is a Create a Car mode. Honestly, this is pretty sweet, and something I believe future Twisted Metal games should try and implement in some capacity. A mode like this just makes sense. That said, being PS1 and being something 989 Studios added to Twisted Metal 4 very late in its development, the mode is extremely limited, only providing you with a small handful of vehicle types and paint jobs to choose from. A shame. I don't think this mode should have been added to the game if this was all it was going to be. Most of the car and special weapon stats suck too. Using them is pretty much useless. The battle cries always gave me a chuckle when I was a kid though.
I'll make you shiver when I deliver!
Alright, so as much as I crap on Twisted Metal 4, it does have one of the more intriguing premises in the entire series. The introductory cutscene is just bonkers. It provides somewhat of an origin for the Twisted Metal contest, showing us that it has been around since the early 1900s as a form of traveling carnival. A small boy had watched the carnage from the sidelines and fell in love with it, choosing to dress up like a clown, run away from home, and join it. This boy is of course Needles Kane. Driving Sweet Tooth, he would become Twisted Metal's most successful competitor, helping Calypso absorb the souls of those killed into his ring to grow stronger. This ring is made the source of Calypso's power in Twisted Metal 4. Needles would end up winning Twisted Metal, and for his prize, he wishes to become the star of it. He is transformed, his hair turns into fire, and his outfit becomes the goofiest it's ever been. Needles would come to understand that he was simply a pawn of Calypso, and start resenting him as the years went on. He would lead a coup with an army of small clowns, and overthrow Calypso as the host of Twisted Metal. He would steal Calypso's ring and toss him out the window of his tower to his presumed death. Unlike past games, we don't know when exactly Twisted Metal 4 takes place. It's safe to assume it's sometime after Twisted Metal 3, which was set in 2008, but neither the game nor its manual give us anything specific to go off of. The futuristic elements in this one could place it decades after the last game for all we know. Since the aesthetic in it is so different, it doesn't even look like it's the same world as before. It could very well be in its own alternate timeline or parallel universe. What is for certain, though, is that the Sweet Tooth in Twisted Metal 4 must be over 100 years old, even before he took over Twisted Metal and came into possession of Calypso's ring. That I find unbelievable, and I think it was something 989 Studios either overlooked themselves or hoped no one playing the game would notice. The only explanation for it is that when he became the star of Twisted Metal, Calypso's powers had also extended his lifespan, or made him some form of immortal. None of it is made clear. I mentioned earlier that the arenas in Twisted Metal 4 are better than those in Twisted Metal 3, because they offer more verticality, none are plain flat surfaces, and the hidden areas, gimmicks, and environmental weapons you can find in them are far more engaging and creative than what was in the previous game. I think a few are too large in size though, and slow the action of Twisted Metal 4 down to a crawl. It can take too long for you and the AI to find each other when the vehicle numbers start to dwindle. There's too much driving and not enough combat happening most times. Something I've always despised about this entry in the Twisted Metal series is that every level ends with a boss battle. While that may sound awesome on paper, they become incredibly exhausting to sit through. They're excessive, another way for the developers to pad out the game's length. They essentially play the same role as the regeneration gimmick did in Twisted Metal 3. Same shit, different shovel. The bosses shackle you to many of these arenas for far too long, causing you to get bored with them before the game mercifully allows you to move on to the next. There are so many bosses in Twisted Metal 4 that the very idea of the boss battle in these games loses all meaning. They become less special. The majority of them are one-on-one and exacerbate the issues I just mentioned regarding the lack of action in this game, spending more time finding your opponent than fighting them. I hate that they are all faceless vehicles too. We don't know who or what any of these drivers are or look like. Even the souped up versions of past characters like Thumper, Axel, and Mr. Slam. Also, preventing you from moving on to the next stage being obstacles in Sweet Tooth's tournament. Does that imply that they all work for him? The same people he had fought and killed in tournaments prior. It doesn't make any sense that they would all be friends now. Twisted Metal 4 has to be in its own universe. That's the only way any of this fits together. Or maybe the ring Needle stole from Calypso has the power to control minds. Or, after they had been killed by Sweet Tooth, they were somehow resurrected, upgraded by its influence. I have no fucking clue. I'm grasping at straws, again. Going through the levels in the game now, the first one in Twisted Metal 4 is the construction yard. It's okay, a nice introductory battleground. There are 4 corners to it that all connect to a central area. In one section, there are pits of toxic waste that can be ignited using certain weapons. Barrels are scattered around as well that explode. There's a crane in the middle you can access and use it to lift up enemies, dropping them onto a conveyor belt where they can get damaged by flamethrowers, which can be easily exploited to do massive damage. The boss of the level is pretty lame, a construction vehicle named Crusher that has a close-range special that squishes you within its jaws. You can't use the crane against it as it gets destroyed the moment it spawns in. Neon City is one of the stronger levels in Twisted Metal 4, and the one that comes to mind when I think of the game. It's a futuristic city with lots of different streets you can race down. Its main component is the hover train that can collide with vehicles and damage them, though it is possible to destroy it. You can also drive through its tunnel, which leads to a rooftop portion of the arena where you can launch yourself to hidden areas using jump pads, and be picked up by the tractor beam of a hovercraft that takes you to health and lightning pickups. The boss here is Moonbuggy, some vehicle designed to drive on the moon, I guess. Its special weapon fires multiple electrical orbs with energy bolts connecting them. You can get ensnared in them if you aren't careful, and they can even pass through walls. Just like the crane in the previous level, the tram in Neon City gets destroyed when Moonbuggy enters the battle, if you or your opponents hadn't destroyed it already. I'm not really a fan of Level 3, Road Rage. It's a bunch of interconnecting highways and on-ramps. The level is just too massive. The developers had to put speed boosts down in certain areas to help you move through it faster. I don't think it's designed very well. Everything about it feels bloated. It takes way too long to find enemies. Usually when I pop this game in to play it, it's at this level that I get bored with Twisted Metal 4 and turn it off. Many times has it been a marker to indicate my patience running dry with the game, so naturally I have a lot of negative feelings towards it now. The boss in it is Super Thumper, the first of the souped-up Twisted Metal characters you face. Stage 4 is a bit of a palate cleanser, the bedroom. It's my favorite level in the game because of its bizarre concept, one of the more unique levels this franchise has ever had. It's supposed to be the dorm room of Sweet Tooth, housing a bed, desk, nightstand, lamps, part of toy ramps you can drive up and down, and cool hidden areas underneath the bed and behind some of the walls. The arena is a weird one and doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have in the game. We don't know if all the vehicles have been shrunken down, possibly by Sweet Tooth or the unknown driver of the stage's boss, RC Car, or if the room itself is just gigantic, but I think the perspective is really neat regardless, and it's the most creative 989 Studios got in their Twisted Metal games in terms of level design, in my opinion. I have a feeling the bedroom level was also, at the very least, a partial inspiration for Twisted Metal Small Brawl that would come out a couple years later. Next up is Amazonia 3000 BC, not to be confused with Amazonia Firewalk, a level from Twisted Metal 2. This one is strange. It's the only level in Twisted Metal history to take place in a time other than the present. All of the competitors have, unexplainably, traveled backwards in time to some ritual site with ancient pedestals and monuments. unlike the Firewalk level from Twisted Metal 2 that had you navigate through and around damaging lava. Amazonia 3000 has a large pit and caves that look to be covered in ice. They might make your vehicle's tires slide a bit, but I couldn't really tell from playing it. I think the ice is just for show. The boss of this stage is Super Axle, who is more metallic in appearance with large spikes coming out of each tire. Arena 6 is the oil rig, an oil platform located somewhere in the ocean, though you can't really tell because there is no visible water texture when you fall. It's fun exploring all the different levels to this stage, avoiding the various pitfalls and other hazards, but your enemies can sometimes freeze spam you, making it a chore to get around, lining up jumps and whatnot. I do really like the boss at the end to close off the oil rig though, because it's against two bosses simultaneously, Super Augur and Super Slam. Unfortunately, their AI isn't very sophisticated. They'll usually end up getting caught in each other's close-range special weapons, inadvertently collide with one another, or fall to their deaths when making jumps, due to their slower speed. So the whole thing wasn't executed as well as it could have been. Poor choices for bosses in what is an otherwise decent level. I used to like Minion's Maze when I was a kid. The gimmick was entertaining enough. But now, whenever I revisit Twisted Metal 4, it's the stage I dread playing the most. I give props to the developers. Having a maze as a battleground, the thought of getting lost in it is great in theory. I like that there are portals everywhere to move everyone around. There's a hidden underground area, and sections of the maze are vertical, not just flat. But the issue is that you become so preoccupied with the confusing navigation in this level that the car combat gets thrown on the back burner. I think it's the worst Twisted Metal 4 has to offer in terms of long sequences of dead air with nothing happening. I think it's the worst stage in the game, and an epic cat-and-mouse boss fight with Minion isn't enough to save it for me. And finally, we have Level 8, the final level of the game and its tournament mode, Sweet Tooth's Carnival. This one is a delight to take in. A sinister amusement park with a roller coaster you can drive on, circus tents, a haunted house, a freak show, and a daredevil jump set up in the center of it. It's a very colorful and eye-popping level to go out on, and I'm sure it's one of the more memorable ones from Twisted Metal 4 for a lot of fans, one of the game's bright spots. The only major downside to it is that it of course ends with one of the hardest boss fights from the entire franchise against Sweet Tooth. I don't like the design of his ice cream truck in Twisted Metal 4. I never have. It looks like a storage unit on wheels. His special weapon is the most devastating in the whole Twisted Metal series. He launches 3 homing henchmen faces that can find you anywhere on the map, which is fucking cheap. One pulls you in, another bombards you with missiles, and the other sets you on fire. When it's finished, all 3 of the clowns explode, dealing massive damage. Most vehicles in the game have their entire health meter drained with a single use of one. 989 Studios had the sense to at least ensure the AI controlling Sweet Tooth never uses his special at a faraway distance, so thankfully you can stay up high on the roller coaster or big top and try your best to chip away at his health. If not, this boss fight would have been impossible. So let's look at the roster of characters in this game and their endings. While still some of the worst in franchise history, collectively they are a tad more interesting and effective than the ones found in Twisted Metal 3. Just like Twisted Metal 3, every ending in the game follows a very simple formula. Your driver finds themselves in Sweet Tooth's office, dressed up like a circus tent. Clowns are bouncing up and down and swinging all over the place. It gets really old after a while, and the visuals and sounds are headache-inducing. Instead of Needles being the one talking to you, it's his main clown henchman Melvin who steals the spotlight, as Sweet Tooth juggles in the background. He might as well be jerking off. This is weird. Melvin is calling the shots even though his master is the one who does the actual wish granting. Just like what I've done with every Twisted Metal game I've reviewed, I will be ranking all of the endings in Twisted Metal 4 from worst to best, in my opinion. And at the bottom of the barrel, we have the ending provided for any of the boss vehicles, as well as your created cars. Since there are no drivers for the vehicles or backstories, you just get a clip of Melvin asking for your wish and saying it's granted. It's very short, a nothing ending. You have to use your imagination as to what happens. I know Twisted Metal 4 came out in the late 90s, it's definitely a product of its time, but the character of Drag Queen still feels like an underhanded cheap shot at gay and trans culture. It's in poor taste. Dennis Petunia Flanders has two passions in life, drag racing and cross-dressing. The game's manual says he was kicked out of the Hot Rod Association for dressing like a woman. It even says seeing him in a halter top would turn anyone to stone. It doesn't help matters that the design they gave her is made to be as sleazy and unclean looking as possible to feed into that anti-drag hysteria. Having Petunia be in love with drag racing on top of being a drag queen is a little on the nose. Same goes for the vehicle's special weapon of dual flamethrowers. Get it? Because Dennis is flaming. Petunia's ending is bad for the same reason Outlaws was in Twisted Metal 3. It's painted to be this nightmarish thing, but in actuality, there's nothing wrong with the outcome whatsoever. She wishes to headline an all-girl show in Vegas and gets that wish, being able to perform in front of thousands. The twist falls flat on its face. It fails miserably. This next one might be controversial to some. For the first and only time in this series, Twisted Metal broke the fourth wall by including a real-life celebrity as one of the contestants. A lot of the licensed music used in Twisted Metals 3 and 4 was from Rob Zombie, so 989 Studios thought it'd be rad to include him as a playable character. I think the novelty of it is pretty cool. His vehicle is the Dragula from his hit song of the same name, his most popular and recognizable by far. The car's special weapon fires a spinning skull that electrifies its opponents and pulls them towards it before exploding and setting them on fire. As a die-hard fan of the Munsters show that features the Dragula though, I must clarify that this car is not, nor has it ever been, the Dragula. It's the Munster coach. The Dragula is the golden coffin on wheels, another vehicle the family owned. Anywho, Mr. Zombie's ending has his weird head companion speak to Melvin, and the two finish each other's sentences. Some fans claim the voice heard from the head here is the real Rob Zombie's, but I doubt he would have given two shits about lending his voice to this game. He probably didn't even know what Twisted Metal was, still doesn't. It's clearly John St. John who voiced many characters in this game, including Melvin. Mr. Zombie's wish is to let the world hear the wails and war cries of a dead man's soul. You get to see a short clip of the music video Super Beast without any lyrics, which I won't show here due to copyright, but that's all it is. As cool as Rob Zombie's work was at this time, how awesome the song and music video is, this isn't much of a wish or ending. I'm sorry. Trash Man is a garbage worker who's missing a few brain cells. He's obsessed with trash and wants the whole planet to be one big landfill. His customized garbage truck's special weapon lifts its enemies up and repeatedly stabs them into the spikes built into its roof. Trash Man is a discount Mr. Slam if there ever was one. His ending is this low on my list because of how lame his wish is, for the world to be garbage. There's not a whole lot of interesting things you can do with that premise, and from the driver's perspective, there's nothing wrong with what happens. He gets what he wants. He's miniaturized and lives out the rest of his days in garbage. This ending is very pointless. Very few of the drivers have real names in Twisted Metal 4. Most of them just share the name of their vehicle. Meter Maid's legal name is Anita Corbett, as referenced in the game's manual. She's one of my least favorite characters in the Twisted Metal series, tied with ATV from Head On. I rarely, if ever, force myself to play as her. Her bio in the manual goes into how dedicated she is. how she was suspended from her job for weapons violations, and that she built an armored meter car with inheritance money to help enforce parking tickets she gives out. But her design and how her personality is presented contradicts all of that. They make her very whorish, dumb, perverted to the max to target the teenage demographic playing this game. Her vehicle's special weapon is a shameful carbon copy of Outlaw's, with the only difference being it siphons her opponent's health into hers. The game manual calls it health sucking, which must have been intentional.
I just can't wait to win this contest. I have a little surprise for Sweet Tooth that I'd like to deliver to him personally.
Anyways, after winning Twisted Metal, Zanita gives Sweet Tooth a ticket and says she will let him off the hook if he does a couple minutes of community service with her, which is heavily implied to be some sort of sexual favor given her tone and cadence. It turns out to be a genuine statement though, and he is forced to take a driver's ed class. It is kind of funny, but the whole approach to this meter-maid character is very tasteless, has aged poorly, and doesn't do her given backstory justice, in my opinion. Something that had a bit of intrigue was turned into a tacky joke. Pizza Boy is another driver given a real name in this game, Connor Nazang. His bio in the instruction manual, just listen to this nonsense. He's become the richest pizza delivery boy in the US because he extorts tips from his customers, intimidating them with weapons strapped to his car. Though he was arrested, the judge was one of his customers and let him off easy with 1,000 hours of community service, delivering pizza for the Twisted Metal competition. Do I even have to explain how ludicrous that sounds? That would imply the government willfully coexists with the horrors of Twisted Metal and throws it a bone every once in a while. Thousands died, but at least that murderous son of a bitch Sweet Tooth got his fresh slice of pepperoni and cheese. Connor's vehicle of choice is his illegal street racer he delivers pizza with. Its special weapon is actually one of my favorites in the game. It's simple. Dual saw blades come out of the sides of his car and slice through enemies like pizza cutters. His wish is to have a street racer like no other. We see him racing Drag Queen and his car begins to rocket into the sky, outer space, and then into a black hole that opens up. It's a scary twist, but one that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Not clever, just random. I don't really know what to make of Quattro. He's a multi-armed intergalactic bounty hunter you can barely understand without subtitles.
Wanted criminals are my prey. Beware, you can run, but you cannot hide. Don't assassinate once. All I want to ask you twice, obey.
Quattro drives a Zion hoverbike. It's the closest Twisted Metal 4 gets to any kind of motorcycle, which is a damn shame. Its special weapon is a pulse of microwave radiation that shoots out in all directions. Good for crowd control, just like Axel's special. Quattro entered Twisted Metal to get to Sweet Tooth, who has a large bounty on his head. His ending results in a Mexican standoff with Needles and his clown gang. Quattro called in backup though. Sweet Tooth's tower, once Calypso's, is surrounded by more alien law enforcement, and Sweet Tooth is arrested for crimes against humanity. It's kinda neat seeing the villain get his just desserts, but this ending doesn't feel that eventful to me or surprising. Having aliens as contestants in Twisted Metal also feels like jumping the shark a little bit, doesn't it? Not only is the premise of Twisted Metal 4 unique, having Sweet Tooth steal the throne of Twisted Metal from its longtime host and creator Calypso, but Calypso also, for the first and only time in the series, has become one of its competitors. How he survived the fall from his tower is beyond me, but I do like the idea of him scratching and clawing his way back to the top, forced to take on and defeat what has become his deadliest creation, Sweet Tooth. The vehicle he drives is a mobile missile launcher, and yeah, I don't know what other type of vehicle would have fit better for him in this game. He's pissed off, bitter, driving around launching nukes at people makes perfect sense. His wish in the end is to obviously steal back his ring and regain control of his contest. For some strange reason, Sweet Tooth's frame rate is slower in the background during this ending. It doesn't happen in any of the others. Whatever company worked on these cutscenes for the game missed something in this one before sending it back to 989. Whoopsies. Calypso and Needles battle over the magic ring like two kids fighting over one from a cereal box. Calypso's tower is torn open, and the souls of the dead escape like it's the Ghostbusters fire hose. Sometime later, a young boy finds the ring in the rubble, and I guess the souls of Calypso and Sweet Tooth are trapped inside, fighting for all eternity. I'd like to put this ending as number 1, seeing as the whole game revolves around these characters and their conflict, but in all honesty, I don't find it all that exciting or memorable. Out of the 2 returning contestants in Twisted Metal 4, Warthog is my favorite, but that's not saying a whole heck of a lot, is it? General Warthog fought in World War I when he was 19. The game's manual lists his age as 99, but like Sweet Tooth, he's most likely well over 100 by now. I love that his vehicle is a World War I era tank. It's different, and it might even be my favorite version of Warthog appearance-wise, spanning all the games. Too bad his special weapon sucks ass through a straw. It's a target you place down so an ion laser from a satellite can fire at it and hopefully hit what you intended it to. Warthog's ending has a decent twist to it, one I enjoy. His wish is to command the most powerful army in the history of war, completely rule over the battlefield. His wish is granted, and we see that he's become a toy, played with by a kid in a sandbox. Now, Microblast as a vehicle and as a character is pretty stupid, one of my least favorite in the franchise. He's a leprechaun, or I guess elf, which is what the game's manual refers to him as. He also drives a wind-up toy car with a special weapon that is nothing more than a series of glorified speed missiles. Boring. His backstory describes him as a circus performer who is now under the employ of Sweet Tooth. His wish, at least the one in the manual, is world domination, but his ending has him wish to simply be taller and for people to look up to him in fear. Before his wish is granted, Melvin awkwardly degrades him with words like enormous, giant, and largely, to mock Microblast's size. But none of these insults work, seeing as all of the clowns are even smaller than he is. It's odd. Anyways, Microblast has his wish granted and becomes as tall as a skyscraper, terrorizing the city like he's Godzilla. He then suddenly turns into a statue and is memorialized forever. The visual is definitely a spooky one. I just wish this character weren't so shallow and cartoony. So the idea behind the Joneses is actually quite amusing, and they're the most memorable original characters in Twisted Metal 4 for me. They're a family that essentially lives in their car and are on endless vacation. They believe that competing in the Twisted Metal tournament has brought them closer together. Aw, they're a parody of the Griswold family from the National Lampoon Vacation movies. They drive a similar station wagon to the one seen in them as well. Its special weapon is a series of missiles fired from each piece of luggage on its roof called Hornets that bear a close resemblance to Warthog's old Patriot missiles. The wish the Joneses have, as well as their ending in general, is stupid, but at least it's one you don't question or feel insults your intelligence in any major way. You go along with its absurdity. The family wants a new state-of-the-art RV, and for Sweet Tooth to be their driver and tour guide. As the group go down a winding road near a cliffside, the Joneses relentlessly annoy Sweet Tooth with car songs, specifically 99 bottles of beer. Frustrated and trapped, Sweet Tooth steers the RV off the cliff and presumably kills them all. It's morbid, sure, but also kind of hilarious. Orbital is kinda neat, and another one of the standout original characters from Twisted Metal 4, a secret agent whose face was horribly disfigured by an evil doctor's biochemical weapon. He drives a fancy sports car like any spy would, and its special is called the Tele-Orb, which is exactly the same as Mr. Zombie's special, just that instead of burning your enemies when it explodes, it freezes them, and you if you're not careful, which is a pain. Orbital's ending is like something out of a Twilight Zone episode. His wish is to be a normal person and no longer live as an outcast. But, as you could probably guess, everyone on Earth is given the same horrifying disfigurement. The ending is a bit basic and predictable, but I do like this character, and his ending is one of the more memorable ones from this game, usually one of the first to pop into my mind when I think of Twisted Metal 4. Goggle Eyes is another one of the original characters from this game I don't mind. Having an exterminator be a contestant of Twisted Metal is a fun idea, and we would see it incorporated later in the 2012 game with the pest control van Vermin. The backstory they give the driver of Goggle Eyes is insane. He was traumatized in his youth after watching a giant cockroach win a pie-eating contest, which had to have been someone in a funny costume, right? He vowed to rid the world of all insects from that day forward, would develop the deadliest pesticide known to man, which his roach coach releases as its special weapon, and would be placed on the Environmental Protection Agency's most wanted list. Jeez Louise. Goggle Eyes' wish is to capture and contain all of the pesky bugs on Earth, something he can't do himself. His ending is one of the shortest in the game, but I find it to be really disturbing. He falls over dead as a seemingly infinite number of bugs fly out of his mouth. Sweet Tooth had used his powers to put them all inside of Goggle Eyes' body. He's contained them just like he asked, but Melvin scolds him for letting them out. Nasty. Picking the best ending in Twisted Metal 4 is difficult, and this kind of thing is very subjective, but if I were to choose a favorite, then it would probably be Captain Grimm's. Mr. Grimm is in this game, but not how he usually appears in Twisted Metal. He's traded his biker chaps for a silly pirate costume. He can no longer talk, but has a parrot on his shoulder that does the speaking for him. Instead of a motorcycle, he drives a pirate ship, or I guess a hot rod made to look like a pirate ship. It's weird. His special weapon went from being the most consistently devastating in Twisted Metal history to one of the shittiest, with a single cannonball blast from the front of his car. The damage is so insignificant, it might as well be a spitball. Based on the nature of his wish, you'd assume he still plays the role of the Grim Reaper in this universe, but this version of the character is such a radical departure from what had come before that it's hard to tell. Captain Grimm wants to have a sword fight with Sweet Tooth that will claim the soul of the first one dead. The two lunge at each other with their swords and slash, with Grimm's parrot being the first and only casualty. Not only is his trusted companion gone, but Grimm is now doomed to silence. How sad. Twisted Metal 3 and 4 aren't as terrible as a lot of people make them out to be, at least from a gameplay perspective. I think each game has some redeeming qualities to it. The graphics in them are decent, more so in regards to Twisted Metal 4. The AI was improved over a lot of the other entries in the series because your opponents would fight each other on top of just attacking you. And as much shade as you want to throw on either game, it was impressive what 989 Studios was able to accomplish with both of these Twisted Metal entries, having to create an engine from the ground up and push a complete game out the door within the span of a year, not even. While Twisted Metal 3 and 4 aren't the best installments in the franchise, they are still two entertaining car combat games in spite of their flaws. They were the first two Twisted Metal games I ever played. If not for them, I wouldn't have played the others, been the fan I am today. So for that, I am forever grateful for their existence. I want to thank you all very much for watching my retrospective on Twisted Metal 3 and 4. I hope you enjoyed it. Share your thoughts on the games and memories you have of them down in the comment section below. If you are a fan of these videos, this kind of content, and my channel as a whole, please think about subscribing and becoming a patron if you can. Any and all support I get goes a long way in keeping this YouTube dream alive. Thanks a bunch. I'll see you all in the next one. Take care of yourselves.